The summer of my 17th year was a weird mix of boredom and excitement. Like clockwork, I went to church camp every year, something my parents insisted on. It wasn't so much about the lessons or the sermons for me, it was more about getting away, meeting people, and seeing if this time it'd be different. This particular camp was set deep in the woods, miles away from anything that resembled civilization. We were surrounded by trees, lakes, and cabins, with little to do besides the scheduled activities. That's how it usually went. But this year, something did feel different, and that difference was Karen. I'd seen her around on the first day, and we'd locked eyes a few times in the awkward way that teenagers do when they're not sure if the other person feels the same. She had this confidence about her, though not in an overbearing way, but just enough to catch my attention. We spent the first few days of camp exchanging glances during group sessions, bumping into each other accidentally between meals, and by day 3, we'd found reasons to talk during the downtime. There was this undeniable chemistry that made the usual humdrum of camp seem suddenly thrilling. Even though we were surrounded by people constantly, it felt like Karen and I were sharing this secret, invisible bond. The conversations were innocent enough on the surface, but there was an underlying current of tension, of something more. As the week progressed, that tension built up. We flirted in the way teenagers do, subtle, playful, and with an air of invincibility, thinking no one would notice. By the time we reached the night of the sardines game, the tension between us had turned into something tangible, something neither of us could ignore any longer. Sardines was one of those games everyone at camp looked forward to. It was the one time of the week when you were encouraged to sneak around in the dark, hiding from the others, and waiting for someone to find you. But the twist, and the part that made it so fun, was that when you found the person hiding, you had to squeeze into their hiding spot with them and wait for the next person to find you. By the end, you'd have a small crowd crammed into the most ridiculous places, trying to stifle their laughter and remain undetected. This year, Karen was the first to hide. When her name was called, she glanced over at me and smiled in a way that sent my heart racing. It was more than just a smile. It was an invitation. As soon as the game started and the lights dimmed, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out discreetly and saw the text, "Behind the sanctuary stairwell. Hurry." I didn't hesitate. My mind wasn't on the game anymore. It was on her, on the electric feeling that had been building all week. The sanctuary was one of the more secluded spots at camp, a place people didn't usually go after hours. It was quiet, dark, and tucked away from the main cabins where most of the other campers were. My footsteps echoed in the stillness as I made my way there, each step quickening with anticipation. When I reached the stairwell, Karen was already waiting. The low light from the hallway cast shadows across her face, but her eyes were bright, mischievous. She didn't say a word. Neither did I. Words weren't necessary. The air between us was charged with the kind of excitement that only comes when you're on the verge of doing something reckless. I sat down beside her, and before I could even process what was happening, she was on her knees. My pulse quickened as she undid my pants, the weight of what was happening hitting me all at once. It was a blur of sensations. Her touch, the quiet of the stairwell, the distant sounds of the other campers playing the game somewhere far off, completely unaware of what we were doing. The thrill of it wasn't just in the act itself, though that was intense enough. It was the fact that we were doing it there, in that moment, with the knowledge that at any second, someone could stumble upon us. Every noise, every distant footstep made my heart race faster. Part of me knew we could have waited, found a better time, a more private place, but the other part, the part fueled by teenage hormones and the intoxicating rush of breaking the rules, couldn't resist the thrill of the danger. As things escalated, the world around us seemed to shrink down to just the two of us. The stairwell became this bubble where nothing else mattered, not the game, not the camp, not the consequences. My senses were on overload, everything amplified by the fear of getting caught. The adrenaline coursing through my veins made every touch feel electric, every sound feel louder than it actually was. But then, in the midst of it all, something made me look up. Through the small, rectangular window in the door at the top of the stairwell, I saw them. At least 8 faces, pressed up against the glass, wide-eyed and slack-jawed. They were watching us, watching me, in the most compromising position imaginable. For a split second, time froze. My brain couldn't quite process what I was seeing. It was like something out of a bad dream, the kind where you realize you're naked in front of a crowd and there's nowhere to hide. But this wasn't a dream. It was real, painfully real. Karen must have sensed the shift in my body language because she stopped and followed my gaze. Her face paled when she saw them. For a moment, we were both frozen, caught in the surreal horror of the situation. I didn't know what to do. Laugh it off? Pretend like it hadn't happened? There was no playbook for a moment like this. Slowly, the door creaked open and one of the campers, a guy about our age, poked his head in. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look on his face said it all. You've been caught. The rest of the week was a blur. Word spread fast, as things like this always do. By breakfast the next morning, everyone knew. Whispers followed me everywhere I went. People didn't even try to be subtle about it. I could feel their eyes on me during meals, during activities, even during group prayer. Every time I walked into a room, the conversations would stop, and then they'd start back up again in hushed tones, punctuated by awkward glances in my direction. Karen and I didn't talk much after that. The chemistry that had seemed so exciting just a few days earlier was now tainted by the humiliation of being caught. We avoided each other as much as possible, sitting on opposite sides of the room during group sessions, barely making eye contact when we crossed paths. The unspoken connection we'd shared was gone, replaced by a heavy, awkward silence. I spent the rest of the week in a kind of daze, trying to navigate the fallout of what had happened. The leaders at camp didn't say anything directly to me, but I could tell they knew. There was this weird tension in their interactions with me, like they weren't sure how to address it without making things worse. So they didn't, and I was left to deal with the consequences on my own. Looking back, it's hard to say what I regret more, the act itself or the way we were caught. The thrill of the moment had been undeniable, but the aftermath was brutal. What had started as a flirtatious game had spiraled into something much bigger, something I wasn't prepared to handle. I spent the rest of the week counting down the days until camp was over, eager to get away from the constant judgment and whispers. By the time the buses rolled up to take us home, I was exhausted. The tension, the embarrassment, the weight of what had happened had taken its toll. I watched Karen from a distance as we packed up our things, wondering if we'd ever speak again. But deep down, I knew we wouldn't. Whatever connection we'd had was buried under the weight of our shared humiliation. As the bus pulled out of the campgrounds and I stared out the window at the trees blurring by, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved to be leaving, to be putting the whole thing behind me. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed some kind of line, that I'd learned something about myself that I wasn't ready to face. That summer changed me. It taught me a lot about impulse, about consequences, and about how a moment of excitement can lead to a lifetime of regret. But it also made me more aware of the choices I made and the reasons behind them. I left camp that year with a new sense of caution, a new understanding of the power of desire, and a resolve to never let myself get caught in a situation like that again.